Most people don't live their own lives. They live reactions, edited to please, adjusted to survive, softened to be accepted. Machiavelli understood this early. The moment you live for others, you surrender control. And control, once lost, is rarely returned. What follows isn't motivation, it's recalibration. By the end, your decisions will feel quieter, colder, and more deliberate. Less explanation, less exposure, more control without announcing it. Machiavelli never argued for cruelty as a virtue. That misunderstanding belongs to people who read slogans instead of behavior. His real warning was about dependence. The moment your identity relies on approval, you lose strategic autonomy. You stop acting from intent and start reacting to expectation. Most people do this unconsciously. They shape their words, choices, and ambitions around what will be rewarded socially, not what is correct for their long-term position. This is not morality. It is conditioning. Approval creates a hidden leash. It feels safe because it is familiar, but it limits movement. When you live for others, your decisions are filtered through fear of rejection, fear of judgment, fear of isolation. That fear narrows options. Machiavelli understood that power requires range. A person who cannot tolerate disapproval cannot make decisive moves when conditions demand it. They hesitate, soften, or delay. Over time, they become predictable. Predictability is not stability, it is vulnerability. Most people believe they are choosing freely. They are not. They are negotiating with invisible audiences in their head. Parents, peers, society, trends, and expectations all take turns steering behavior. Machiavelli observed that whoever controls your incentives controls you. If praise dictates your confidence and criticism dictates your restraint, you are governed externally. You may appear functional, even successful, but your core decisions are outsourced. That is why so many capable people feel empty despite visible progress. Living for yourself is not emotional rebellion. It is structural independence. It means your values are internally anchored and not adjusted every time the environment shifts. Machiavelli would argue that a ruler who constantly seeks love becomes weak because love is conditional and unstable. The same applies psychologically. When your self-image depends on being liked, you become manipulable. People sense this instinctively. They may not articulate it, but they exploit it through pressure, guilt, or praise. Very few people are willing to accept the cost of independence. That cost is temporary discomfort. When you stop performing, some approval disappears. Some relationships thin out. Some people misunderstand your silence as arrogance or coldness. Machiavelli would see this as a necessary filtration process. What falls away was never aligned with your sovereignty to begin with. What remains is quieter, fewer, and more real. The disciplined individual does not seek to be admired. He seeks to be unmovable. His sense of direction does not fluctuate with opinion. He listens, observes, and extracts information, but he does not surrender authorship of his life. This is the core lesson most people avoid because it removes excuses. Once you stop living for others, every outcome belongs to you. That responsibility is heavy. That is why most people choose comfort over control. Power begins where self-justification ends. When you no longer need to explain your choices, you conserve energy and signal certainty. Others feel it immediately. They adjust expectations, test less, and speak more carefully. Not because you demand it, but because internal alignment produces an authority that does not ask permission or approval. Approval is one of the most misunderstood forces in human behavior. Most people believe it is a reward, something earned through effort or virtue. In reality, it is a transaction, and like any currency, it loses value when oversupplied. Machiavelli recognized this long before modern psychology gave it language. The person who constantly seeks approval advertises need. Need invites influence. Influence, when unearned, becomes control. The pursuit of approval subtly reshapes behavior. You begin to speak in ways that are safer rather than truer. You delay decisions until you sense consensus. You avoid necessary conflict and mistake avoidance for wisdom. Over time, this creates a pattern. Your actions become optimized for acceptance, not effectiveness. Machiavelli would view this as a strategic error. Power does not come from being liked by many, it comes from being unnecessary to none and dependent on no one. Silence is where this dynamic becomes visible. Most people fill silence with explanation because they fear misinterpretation. They rush to clarify intentions, justify choices, and soften edges. This is not transparency, it is exposure. When you explain yourself too much, you hand others material to evaluate, question, and reshape. Machiavelli understood that restraint creates asymmetry. The one who speaks less controls more of the frame. The one who seeks approval forfeits that control voluntarily. There is a reason approval feels addictive. It provides immediate emotional feedback. Praise stabilizes identity temporarily, criticism destabilizes it. This trains the mind to look outward for regulation. Machiavelli would argue that a person governed by external feedback cannot lead, decide, or dominate circumstances consistently. Their internal state is too easily disrupted. Stability, in psychological terms, is power, and stability requires independence from fluctuating opinion. Most people confuse humility with self-erasure. They believe downplaying themselves earns trust and likability. In practice, it erodes perceived authority. When you constantly seek confirmation, others subconsciously place themselves above you. They become the evaluators, and you become the applicant. Machiavelli observed that those who hold power rarely ask to be validated. Their certainty, not their friendliness, establishes their position. When you stop chasing approval, a shift occurs. Your actions slow down. Your words become precise. You no longer rush to correct misunderstandings that do not threaten your long-term position. This restraint unsettles people at first. They are used to access to emotional responsiveness, to being able to influence through reaction. When that access is removed, respect often replaces familiarity. Very few understand that approval follows strength, not the other way around. It is an after effect, not a strategy. Machiavelli would consider it foolish to build identity on something so unstable. The disciplined individual uses approval selectively. He accepts it without needing it and ignores it without resentment. That neutrality is what makes him difficult to manipulate. The moment you detach your sense of self from applause, you reclaim authorship. Your decisions no longer require permission. Your silence carries more weight than explanation ever could. Others may not like it. That is irrelevant. What matters is that your position becomes harder to challenge because it is no longer open for negotiation through praise or criticism. Most people mistake compliance for kindness and fear for virtue. They tell themselves they are being understanding, patient, or morally superior, when in reality they are avoiding discomfort. Machiavelli would recognize this pattern immediately. It is not ethical strength, it is strategic weakness. When a person consistently chooses harmony over truth, they condition others to expect concession. Over time, that expectation becomes entitlement. Fear is rarely acknowledged directly. It disguises itself as politeness, flexibility, or open-mindedness. People say yes when they want to say no, agree when they feel resistance, and remain silent when speech would correct the situation. They do this not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack positioning. Machiavelli understood that fear shapes behavior long before logic enters the picture. The individual who fears rejection will always negotiate against himself first. This self-negotiation is where power leaks away. Before anyone applies pressure, the compliant person preemptively reduces his own demands. He anticipates disapproval and adjusts in advance. This creates a pattern of self-erasure. Each concession feels small, even reasonable, but collectively they redefine his role. Others begin to see him as flexible, accommodating, safe. Those labels sound positive, yet they often signal low resistance. Machiavelli observed that people respect boundaries they encounter, not intentions they are told about. When you constantly soften your stance to maintain peace, you teach others that your limits are negotiable. Conflict avoidance does not eliminate conflict, it merely delays it and shifts its cost onto you. The price is paid internally through resentment, loss of self-respect, and diminished authority. There is a difference between restraint and submission. Restraint is a choice made from strength. Submission is a reaction made from fear. Most people confuse the two because submission feels easier in the moment. It avoids confrontation and preserves surface-level harmony. Machiavelli would argue that such harmony is fragile and dependent. It collapses the moment your usefulness declines or your compliance stops. When you live for others, you train yourself to be manageable. You become someone who can be pressured with guilt, praise, or the threat of withdrawal. This is why manipulative dynamics persist even among intelligent people. Manipulation does not require stupidity, it requires access. Fear grants that access willingly. Once others know you fear being disliked or excluded, they hold leverage without ever stating it. Strategic individuals accept discomfort early to avoid subjugation later. They allow tension to exist without rushing to dissolve it. Machiavelli understood that the ability to withstand social friction is a form of power. It signals that your identity is not dependent on immediate approval. That signal changes how others approach you. Requests become more careful, expectations become more realistic. Most people never examine this dynamic because it challenges their self-image. They prefer to see themselves as kind rather than afraid. But Machiavelli was uninterested in comforting illusions. He focused on outcomes, and the outcome of living in fear disguised as virtue is predictable loss of influence, erosion of self-direction, and a life shaped by avoidance rather than intent. The moment you stop calling fear morality, clarity begins. You recognize when you are choosing silence for strategy and when you are choosing it to hide. That awareness alone begins to shift your position, not through aggression, but through the quiet removal of automatic compliance. Power is rarely found in urgency. Urgency belongs to those who feel behind, exposed, or replaceable. Machiavelli understood that speed, when driven by anxiety, is a tell. People who rush to act, speak, or respond reveal that they are being pulled by circumstance rather than directing it. True authority moves differently. It is unhurried, selective, and aware of the larger frame. Most people act too early because silence makes them uncomfortable. They interpret pauses as loss of relevance. This leads them to over-communicate, over-commit, and over-explain. Machiavelli would see this as a failure of timing. When you speak before the situation has fully revealed itself, you trade short-term relief for long-term disadvantage. Information is still forming, alliances are still shifting, and yet the impatient person locks himself into a position prematurely. Timing is not about delay for its own sake. It is about observation. The individual who waits gathers asymmetrical information. He watches who reacts emotionally, who overreaches, who contradicts themselves. Those reactions reveal priorities, insecurities, and pressure points. Machiavelli valued this advantage deeply. Knowledge gained through patience allows you to act with precision rather than force. People who live for others struggle with timing because they are reactive. They feel compelled to respond immediately to maintain approval or relevance. A delayed response feels risky to them. Silence feels like abandonment. This is why they speak when they should listen and commit when they should remain ambiguous. Machiavelli would argue that such behavior places control in the hands of whoever demands the fastest reaction. Silence, when intentional, creates gravity. It forces others to fill the space. They project assumptions, reveal intentions, and sometimes overplay their hand. The quiet individual does not interrupt this process. He allows it to unfold. This is not passivity, it is containment. The one who can hold silence without discomfort controls the tempo of the interaction. Most people misunderstand power as visibility. They believe being seen, heard, and noticed is influence. Machiavelli observed the opposite. Influence comes from being able to act when others cannot predict you. Overexposure eliminates surprise. When everyone knows what you think, want, or plan, your range of movement collapses. Strategic restraint preserves optionality. There is also a cost to early action that few acknowledge. Once you commit publicly, retreat becomes expensive. Your ego becomes involved. Your reputation becomes attached. This traps you into defending positions that may no longer serve you. Machiavelli favored flexibility over consistency. The disciplined individual values effectiveness more than appearing decisive. Those who master timing often appear calm, even detached. This unsettles people accustomed to immediate feedback. They mistake it for indifference or arrogance. In reality, it is control. By acting later, they act from clarity rather than pressure. Their moves carry weight because they are informed, not impulsive. The ability to wait is a psychological advantage, not a moral one. It requires emotional regulation and confidence in one's position. Most people never develop it because they outsource their sense of urgency to others. Machiavelli's lesson is simple but difficult. Whoever controls the timing controls the outcome. Emotions are not weaknesses by nature. They become weaknesses when they are allowed to dictate behavior without supervision. Machiavelli understood that the problem was never feeling, but reacting. Most people confuse emotional honesty with emotional surrender. They allow guilt, anger, pride, or praise to override judgment, then rationalize the outcome afterward. This is not authenticity. It is lack of command. Guilt is one of the most effective tools of influence. It bypasses logic and targets identity. People comply not because the request is reasonable, but because refusal threatens how they see themselves. Machiavelli would recognize guilt as a form of leverage that only works on those who internalize it automatically. The disciplined individual acknowledges guilt without obeying it. He examines whether it serves a real obligation or merely someone else's comfort. Praise works the same way in the opposite direction. It inflates the ego and invites dependency. When approval becomes emotionally regulating, it gains control over decision-making. You begin to act in ways that preserve the source of praise rather than the integrity of your position. Machiavelli warned against this subtle captivity. A person who needs to be affirmed is easier to steer than one who can tolerate indifference. Emotional discipline does not mean becoming cold or detached from human experience. It means creating a pause between stimulus and response. That pause is where choice lives. Most people do not pause. They react instantly, driven by habit and conditioning. Machiavelli would argue that such immediacy is a liability. It makes behavior readable. Readable people are manageable. When others realize they can provoke a predictable emotional response, they gain access. Anger can be baited. Guilt can be triggered. Flattery can disarm. Emotional discipline removes these entry points. The disciplined individual still feels, but his feelings do not announce his next move. This creates uncertainty, and uncertainty shifts power. There is a common belief that strong emotions indicate sincerity. In strategic terms, they indicate exposure. Machiavelli valued opacity over expression, not because expression is wrong, but because it should be selective. When everything is visible, nothing is protected. The individual who reveals only what is useful retains control of the interaction. Most people believe emotional control suppresses their humanity. In reality, it preserves it. Without control, emotions are exploited by others or by circumstance. With control, emotions become information. They signal internal states without commanding action. This distinction separates self-directed individuals from those who are constantly pulled off course. Discipline also protects long-term goals. Many failures are not caused by lack of ability, but by momentary emotional compromise. A single reaction can damage a position built over years. Machiavelli understood that consistency of self-command outweighs bursts of intensity. Quiet control compounds. Emotional indulgence erodes. When you stop allowing emotions to decide for you, something shifts. Interactions become cleaner. Manipulation becomes visible. Pressure loses urgency. Others sense that emotional tactics no longer work as expected. They may escalate, withdraw, or adjust. All of these responses provide information. Emotional discipline is not about domination over others. It is about sovereignty over yourself. Once that sovereignty is established, external attempts to influence you lose force. You remain present, aware, and unmoved unless movement serves your intent. There is a quiet divide that shapes most human interactions, though few ever name it. On one side are those who live externally, calibrating themselves against opinion, trends, and immediate reward. On the other are those who live internally, guided by principles that do not shift with the room. Machiavelli observed this divide long before psychology formalized it. He understood that power flows toward those who are not governed by the moment. The externally driven individual is always adjusting. His language changes depending on who is present. His convictions soften under pressure. His priorities rearrange themselves in response to praise or resistance. This flexibility is often mistaken for adaptability, but it is actually instability. Machiavelli would recognize it as a lack of internal command. Without a fixed center, behavior becomes reactive, and reaction seeds control. Those who live internally operate differently. They are not rigid, but they are anchored. Their values are not debated in real time. Decisions are filtered through long-term positioning rather than short-term comfort. This does not make them emotionless, it makes them deliberate. Machiavelli saw this deliberateness as the foundation of agency. When your direction is self-defined, external forces lose their ability to pull you off course. Most people resist this shift because it comes with a cost they are unwilling to pay. Internal living often requires choosing discomfort now to preserve autonomy later. It may mean declining approval, enduring misunderstanding, or standing alone temporarily. Machiavelli never promised ease. He promised effectiveness. Those who demand comfort rarely earn control. The unaware often interpret internal stability as arrogance or detachment. They are accustomed to emotional mirroring and immediate reassurance. When they encounter someone who does not seek alignment, it unsettles them. They probe, test, and attempt to re-establish influence. Machiavelli would advise allowing this process to unfold. Resistance reveals dependence. Curiosity reveals respect. There is also a difference in how time is perceived. The externally driven live in the present reaction cycle. They optimize for today's outcome, today's image, today's validation. The internally anchored think in sequences. They understand that one decision shapes the next 5. Machiavelli emphasized foresight not as prediction but as preparation. You cannot prepare if your priorities shift with every stimulus. This separation is not about intelligence or status. Highly educated, socially successful people can still be externally governed. Influence does not require brilliance, it requires access. When your emotional state is open to modulation, access exists. The internally anchored reduce that access, not through hostility, but through consistency. Most people never cross this divide because it removes comforting narratives. You can no longer blame misunderstanding, lack of support, or external pressure. Once you choose internal governance, outcomes become your responsibility. Machiavelli understood that most people prefer justification over authorship. Authors have no one to appeal to when the result disappoints them. The shift toward internal living is subtle but decisive. You stop asking what will be accepted and start asking what is aligned. Your behavior becomes less reactive and more intentional. Others may feel distance, but what they are sensing is not coldness. It is self-containment. This level of awareness changes how you move through the world. You speak less but with clarity. You commit less but with precision. And while fewer people may feel close to you, more will take you seriously. Boundaries are not created through explanation. They are created through behavior. Most people misunderstand this and exhaust themselves trying to justify their limits instead of enforcing them. Machiavelli understood that once you explain too much, you invite negotiation. The moment a boundary requires persuasion, it is already weakened. When you stop performing for others, something immediate happens. Expectations shift. People who were accustomed to your availability, flexibility, or emotional access begin to feel resistance. They may not articulate it clearly, but they sense that a previous advantage is no longer guaranteed. This is often when testing begins. Small provocations appear, requests become slightly unreasonable. Guilt is applied subtly. Machiavelli would see this not as conflict, but as information. Testing reveals who benefited from your lack of boundaries. Those who respected you for who you are will adjust quickly. Those who relied on your compliance will escalate. This distinction is critical. Many people retreat at this stage, mistaking resistance for failure. In reality, resistance is confirmation. It proves that your previous openness was being used, not appreciated. Machiavelli believed that authority stabilizes only when it is no longer dependent on explanation. When your actions are consistent, people learn where the line is without being told. They may not like it, but they understand it. Understanding creates predictability. Predictability, when self-defined, is power. Most people fear losing relationships when they stop performing. What they fail to see is that many relationships are structured around access, not respect. Access to your time. Access to your emotional labor. Access to your compliance. When that access is reduced, the relationship either rebalances or dissolves. Machiavelli would argue that both outcomes are favorable. A relationship that survives without exploitation is stronger. One that collapses was already hollow. There is also a shift in how others speak to you. When boundaries are enforced without hostility, language becomes more careful. Requests become clearer. Manipulative tactics lose effectiveness. This is not because you demand respect, but because ambiguity has been removed. People no longer assume they can push and recover later. They understand that consequences exist, even if they are subtle. Machiavelli understood that independence filters alliances naturally. You do not need to confront everyone or announce a transformation. Your behavior does the work quietly. Consistency over time sends a stronger signal than any declaration. Those who remain are aligned with your autonomy. Those who leave create space. The disciplined individual accepts the solitude that may come with this shift, not as punishment, but as clarity. Silence becomes less threatening. Time alone becomes productive rather than empty. This internal stability further reinforces external boundaries. When you no longer fear being alone, leverage disappears from others' hands. Most people never reach this stage because they seek validation for their independence. That defeats the purpose. True autonomy does not ask to be recognized. It operates without applause. Machiavelli would see this as the final separation between those who manage impressions and those who manage outcomes. Once boundaries are embodied rather than explained, your presence changes. You are no longer someone to be tested casually. Interactions become more intentional. And while fewer people may feel entitled to you, those who do engage do so with clarity, respect, and caution. This video is for educational and informational purposes only. The strategies and concepts discussed are based on historical analysis and psychological theories. Results may vary and are not guaranteed. Viewer discretion is advised.